Professor Mohammad Marandi, welcome to Red Lines.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to have a wide-ranging conversation today, but I wanted to start in Iran, where this week the country was hit by several attacks targeting its key nuclear sites. And according to reporter Elijah Magnier, quote, high-ranking personnel in Tehran say that investigations have concluded and the latest explosions may well have been related. Indications are that Israel plus another Middle Eastern country are involved. Iran is studying its suitable and inevitable retaliation. I'm wondering, what might that other Middle Eastern country be, and why do you believe Israel would launch this offensive now?
Well, I don't know exactly everything about the attack on Natanz. It wasn't a drone attack, and it wasn't a cyber attack, from my understanding. Other than that, though, there weren't any attacks. And this is one of the things that I find very extraordinary, that whatever happens in Iran, if there's an incident somewhere, if there's a electrical power plant that is damaged or there's a fire, then immediately you're going to have all this online chatter or claims being made, or ambiguous claims being made that this was an attack carried out by another country, the United States or Israel. None of the incidents that we had in Iran were extraordinary. You have to keep in mind that it is the middle of summer and people are using their ACs. And of course, some of the electrical power plants or the petrochemical plants or refineries, they're not kept in an ideal situation because of the sanctions. So it is, not extraordinary for incidents to happen. Or for example, in the clinic, where the oxygen capsules exploded and a number of people were killed, it was a privately owned clinic. It had nothing to do with any government institution. So as far as I know, there was one attack. That attack was sabotage. But my understanding is that that was complicated and that it was led by the United States, or it was carried out by the United States. I don't know much more, but I can say with confidence that besides that, none of the other incidents were attacks. It's sort of like if tomorrow in the United States there's a fire somewhere in a petrochemical plant, then the Iranians, or at least people online attributed to Iran, take some sort of responsibility for it, or some sort of fire in some building, government building in Israel or in Saudi Arabia. So I think people should be more cautious about what they hear online. Just last night in the west of Tehran, it was said that there were multiple explosions and electricity went out, and then we discovered that it was just untrue this morning. Apparently some people were up till morning online arguing about something that never really happened. Fortunately, I was asleep, so I didn't lose any sleep on that particular instance. But I think that the Americans are attempting to create a situation inside Iran where people live in fear. So whenever something happens, you see all these Persian language media channels like the VOA, the BBC Persian, Deutsche Welle, others, Iran International, which is a Saudi channel, and a lot of other channels. There are more Persian language media channels being funded by foreign powers that are beaming into Iran than there are actual TV channels inside Iran. And of course, online activities are quite extensive. There are thousands of people that belong to the MEK terrorist organization that once fought for Saddam Hussein against Iran. They're Iranians, but they betrayed Iran, fought for Saddam Hussein. Now they work for the Americans. They have offices across Europe and the United States, but their main base is in Albania right now. So thousands of people there are staging online warfare against Iran through thousands of different Facebook and Twitter accounts and Instagram accounts. And of course, none of the corporations in the United States or Facebook or Twitter or Instagram doesn't stop them because they're doing it in cooperation with U.S. intelligence services. So they're right now creating an atmosphere or attempting to create an atmosphere of fear in Iran. And I think that the Americans right now are pushing to create some sort of unrest inside the country within the coming weeks.
You mentioned the way media is manipulated, and now even you're saying that maybe some of these incidents we've seen in Iran are exaggerated. How does all this make up the U.S. media attempts to encourage instability in Iran? How does that actually take place? What is the script that you've seen continuously play out in the lead up to these kinds of demonstrations or difficult periods in Iran?
Well, first and foremost is the sanctions. And the Americans are trying to create as much suffering as possible, to have as many people die as possible as a result of the sanctions. And we now see this policy is expanding. It's no longer just Iran. It's Iran, Venezuela, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and Cuba, of course. And so the Americans, and of course now China and Russia. So the Americans are increasingly using sanctions as a weapon. And they are trying to create as much suffering in Iran as possible in the hope that people will become angry and upset, and that they will ultimately turn against the government or the state and bring down the Islamic Republic and bring some government that would be closely aligned to the United States, I suppose. So it's the sanctions first and foremost. The intention is to create maximum suffering.
Secretary of State Mike Pompeo even said this once. He said they want the Iranian people to rise up.
Absolutely, yes. And the thing, and what I find most extraordinary is that no one in the U.S. media or among major figures in the United States are outraged by the fact that the United States is intentionally targeting children, women, the elderly, the vulnerable. They're trying to destroy lives, people losing their jobs, people losing their ability to sustain their livelihoods, people being unable to purchase medicine or finding medicine. I mean, I think that's as evil as it gets. But there's complete silence about that. And it's not just Iran. Nowadays, we see that the Americans are hell-bent on destroying Lebanon. And they're creating a great deal of misery in the country, basically trying to force the nation, the people of Lebanon, to get down on their knees.
Right.
To the United States.
I'll ask more about Lebanon in a moment. But I'm sorry, I veered you off the path a little bit just to get back to the question of the script, the way the United States, there's the sanctions. What other mediums does it use to manipulate the public?
Well, as I said earlier, there are large amounts of Persian language media that are funded by the United States or by European partners, either owned or funded by them, and by the Saudis, the Israelis, among others. They have a huge online army in Albania. So you have all these television channels, all these websites or Telegram channels, and you have TV channels. You have all these combined, and they're waging psychological warfare against Iran 24 hours a day. The theme is always that Iranians are the most miserable people in the world. Your country is falling apart. Things are terrible. The government's lying to you. It's just day and night. And it's the BBC Persian, VOA. They're all basically giving the same message. They're trying to create a sense of despair and depression among ordinary Iranians, they spread rumors. It's psychological warfare, and so that combined with the sanctions, as well as, of course, the constant bombardment of bad news abroad. So, for example, these media outlets will quote the Prime Minister of Iraq as saying something which he actually hasn't said against Iran, or a Lebanese official, or you'll constantly hear both misinformation about what's going on inside the country, and alongside that, what's happening or what's being said about Iran outside the country. In fact, one good example is that BBC Persian was saying how incompetent Iran was at the beginning of the coronavirus outbreak. And a number of Iranian officials got the virus. And BBC Persian was saying this just shows how awful the regime is, the word regime and what that means, and how incompetent they are. And look, even their leaders are getting ill. But then when things began to explode in Britain, and then the British Prime Minister got the virus, the BBC Persian downplayed that completely, and in fact said, the fact that British leaders get the virus is because they are, working day and night to protect the people, and they're among the people. And so the narrative shifts completely. And while I'm a huge critic of BBC, the English channel, the BBC World, I do appear on BBC every now and then, and I'm grateful for that. But while I am a huge critic, BBC Persian is really a caricature of BBC. There's no real similarity. And another thing is that these Persian media outlets in general, they are very hostile towards Arabs. So you will see a lot of Arabic media channels that are hostile against Iranians and Persians, very racist. And you will see the Persian channels being beamed into Iran, funded by the West, very hostile towards Arabs, very racist. And it's extraordinary. I think that if they were actually translated into English, or if you just remove Persian and put in black or African American or any other race, that there would be uproar in the United States if those texts were translated into English. So it's quite extraordinary. I've encouraged a number of my students to work on these issues and to start following up on like a particular channel and the narrative and so on, and to do a thesis on that. But some of my students are a bit cautious because they're afraid that if they publish something that's very critical, that may prevent them from getting visas to go to conferences or continuing their education abroad. So it's complicated, but it's very fascinating.
I was going to say, it sounds like the perfect academic study, what you've just described, translating some of these broadcasts. Professor Marandi, this week the United Nations ruled that the U.S.'s January assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani was, quote, unlawful and arbitrary under international law. In response, former White House National Security Advisor John Bolton tweeted, quote, "This is why exactly we withdrew from UN human rights. We don't answer to a higher power in the UN, nor do we need advice on how to implement the U.S. Constitution." What is your reply to that?
Well, one of the things that I regret is that, well, I don't know if I regret, but a number of years ago, well before Trump became president, I was supposed to do a debate with Bolton on U.S.-Iran, and he pulled out at the last moment. This was like maybe 10, 12 years ago, maybe a decade ago. I don't recall exactly. It was a long time ago, 7, 8, 10 years ago. I'm not quite sure. And ultimately it was someone else. But I don't think we should have any expectations. And it's not just Bolton, it's the United States. The problem in the United States is not Bolton and it's not Trump. The problem in the United States is American exceptionalism, and that the Americans think that they have exceptional rights, that they have greater authority, that they are more, let's say, civilized than the rest of us, and therefore that these give them special privileges, and that those special privileges are moral because of their superior existence. So,
yeah, apparently the U.S. Constitution applies to the whole world, according to Ambassador Bolton.
Well, it's not only that. The point is that anyone that the United States dislikes or the U.S. government, he's automatically evil. And therefore, it will be accepted that he deserves to die or she deserves to die. The question is it legal or not? So in the United States, no one in the establishment is going to say General Soleimani is a good person. I personally see him as a hero, and I think that Europeans and Americans should be very grateful to him, because he is the person, first and foremost, who defeated ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Jaish al-Islam and Ahrar al-Sham and all these other extremist organizations in Iraq and Syria. Of course, Abu Mahdi al-Mohandis, his Iraqi counterpart, and others in Syria and elsewhere, they were all a part of this. But he was the person who led this battle. It wasn't the United States that defeated ISIS. I mean, the United States helped create ISIS. And we know that from all sorts of documentation, which we don't need to get into right now. The U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency document of 2012, General Michael Flynn's interview. There are a host of other pieces of evidence, WikiLeaks, the Clinton emails, and the Secretary of State, the former U.S. Secretary of State, Kerry, when he said that the U.S. allowed ISIS to advance on Damascus. And there are a lot of other documents out there, or there's evidence out there. There's a lot of evidence showing what the role of the United States. But General Soleimani and his men and his allies and the people who cooperated with him were the people who, fought on the ground. And General Soleimani himself was actually in the front lines fighting. So the United States, when it antagonizes someone, that person is automatically evil. So, for example, if one day in the future I'm killed by a U.S. drone, you can rest assured that everyone will agree that I deserved it. But there will be a disagreement as to whether it was the right thing to do. That's the problem that the United States has. So right now, I know that Grayzone has covered the alleged chemical attacks in Syria. And we know that some of these attacks, they were staged. We know them. We know that the last attack in Duma, it was staged. The OPCW, whistleblowers, they provided enough evidence to show, the reality on the ground. And we know that on all, I think, the 4 instances where a chemical attack took place or was allegedly or had allegedly taken place, in all 4 cases, the Syrian government was actually winning on the battlefield, and there was no reason for them to do such a thing. However, Syria aside, these 4 instances aside, in the case of Iran, the United States and the Europeans gave Saddam Hussein the ability to carry out thousands of strikes, chemical strikes against our country, repeatedly, day after day after day, openly, through planes, through artillery. And I personally survived 2 chemical attacks. I survived 1 chemical attack in the Khaybar operation and 1 in the final days of the war, which was a mustard attack, which was not pretty. I survived 2 attacks out of so many different attacks. If the Americans are so outraged, or the Europeans are so outraged about chemical weapons, then right now many of those people who gave Saddam Hussein those weapons are in power right now. People in the Reagan administration continue to work with Trump. Many of these companies, their CEOs and many of those, State Department officials and CIA officials and Pentagon officials and companies that were cooperating, those people, many of them continue to, be active today. They've committed war crimes infinitely worse than anything that we've seen with regards to chemical weapons in Syria. So how is it possible? I mean, even now as we speak, people in Iran are dying because of the chemical weapons, because they die a slow death. It gets, people get cancer or people's lungs deteriorate. I know one of my colleagues at the university, his brother died last year because he finally succumbed to his wounds. So it's a very long and painful death. And people as we speak are still going through that process. Or one of my close friends who on both occasions was with me when we survived the chemical attacks, his child was very badly deformed, and so he never had any more children. His second child. And the doctor said that it may have been, fortunately his first child was fine, but the second child was so badly deformed, and the doctor said it was quite possibly because of the chemical weapons that he decided never to have children again. So, it's something that people in Iran are still living through. And then when the Americans or the Europeans, speak, they're outraged, forget the fact that these are false flag operations and their own terrorists and their own extremists and their own allies carried out these attacks. And on 2 or 3 of the 4 occasions, the Iranians actually warned beforehand that there was going to be a false flag operation. And then the Americans went and bombed those very same places where the munitions were allegedly stored. And if they were, then that would have caused a catastrophe. The air base that they bombed, if they had bombed the munitions, if there were truly, chemical weapons there, then you would have had a catastrophe in Syria. But nothing happened. And the reason is because they knew there were no chemical weapons there. The only reason, by the way, why the Syrian government had chemical weapons in the first place was that it was their deterrent to the Israeli nuclear weapons.
Professor Marandi, I can assure you, if you are ever killed in a drone strike, we at the Grayzone will speak out against that and make sure that people here don't believe you deserved it.
Thank you. I don't know how to respond to that.
Well, you brought up the point, so I had to say that it won't be everyone. Not everyone will say you deserved it.
I mean, the corridors of power, of course. I mean, the U.S. political establishment, the media. Iran is so, deeply antagonized, and sadly, it's antagonized even among progressives. I mean, when I speak to friends in the United States, it's less so now, but they're so, heavily bombarded by nonsense that they think that Iran is, the irony is, of course, that the United States is allied to Saudi Arabia, which promotes this, what used to be a very obscure ideology, Wahhabism. The only reason why it's no longer obscure is because of oil wealth and because the United States and the Saudis use this ideology as a tool. And so many people in the West actually, many dislike Iran, but the things that they attribute to Iran are the things that their own allies among, in Saudi Arabia and others are promoting or creating or carrying out through groups such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the many other different types of extremist groups that exist. And it's been Iran that has, been supporting liberation movements, whether in South Africa. Iran supported Nelson Mandela. One of the first places that he visited after his freedom was Iran, when he was still a terrorist according to U.S. law. He continued to remain a terrorist according to U.S. law until after his presidency came to an end. It was only removed from the books in 2008, I think, when he was no longer a terrorist. But or Iran's support for Nicaragua.
Now Venezuela.
when the U.S. was supporting the Contras, the Contras were not very dissimilar to ISIS, or Cuba or Venezuela now. A lot of what is said about Iran in the United States is very different from reality. I've written actually a couple of articles on this and critique the narratives on Iran, some of the memoirs that were written about Iran, but I think we still have a long way to go for people to see through those myths. But in a way, I'm somewhat more optimistic than before, because I think so many Americans are now questioning the narratives that exist in their own country, that maybe in future they'll be more willing to be more open about what goes on abroad. There's a good book about Iran that I would advise your listeners or viewers to take a look at, and that is Going to Tehran. It was written by Flint and Hillary Leverett, who were both in the White House. I think Flint Leverett resigned over the Iraq War. Their book is actually pretty good. I'm not saying that I agree with everything in the book, but it is one of the few books on Iran that I actually thought was fair.
This sort of brings me to my next question, since we're in an election year here in the United States, Professor Marandi. How do you think the average Iranian views the competition between Donald Trump and Joe Biden? Do they see a difference? Do they see a stake? Do they feel a stake in the outcome?
There are two ways of looking at this. I think ordinary Iranians would like to see Trump lose. They just hate Trump. And I think it's sort of like what you see everywhere else in the world. He's because he's so crude, because of the murder of General Soleimani, who I'm sure you saw the images in Iran, the millions of people in Tehran who went to his funeral, the millions of people who went to his funeral in other cities and in Iraq. And it just showed how popular he was in Iraq and in Iran. So he's deeply despised in Iran. But I think that the decision makers in Iran are much more ambivalent. I don't think they see a huge difference between Trump and Biden. I think that they probably see certain advantages in Trump remaining in power, because Trump has destroyed U.S. soft power. He has destroyed the U.S. relationship with a number of key countries, and that has benefited Iran. I mean, Iran is widely supported outside of the Western countries and the Western governments. Iran has a lot of sympathy in Asia and Africa and in the Americas and in public opinion, because Trump is. But the Iranians don't believe that Trump was really all that different from Obama, and I know that many Americans will question this. And I'm talking about Iranian elites. I'm not talking ordinary Iranians. I think they're more against Trump. They want him out. But I think that people in Iran who are involved in the decision-making process, many of them think that Trump, as I said, provides certain advantages for Iran, because he's hurt the U.S. image, and that has advantages for the country. And I think that the feeling among these people is that Obama wasn't much different. Again, these brutal sanctions, I think Trump calls them brutal sanctions. A similar set of sanctions were first put forward by Obama, and I think he called them crippling sanctions. They weren't enforced as harshly as under Trump, but they had a similar effect. And it only eased after the U.S. was forced to accept Iran's right to enrich uranium, and then the negotiations began, which led to the nuclear deal, which is, a deal that Trump dislikes for his own reasons. Some people in Iran dislike it as well, but in any case, it was a deal. But Obama, he was just as cruel to ordinary Iranians as was Trump. And then we had drone strikes and Obama's, the destruction of Syria. I personally believe, and many people here believe, that the person who's most responsible for the murder of hundreds of thousands of Syrians is Obama, not President Assad, because this was a dirty war that the United States initiated. They brought in all the or they led this operation to bring tens of thousands of foreign fighters into the country. Or the destruction of Yemen. The United States helped Saudi Arabia carry out this, stranglehold over the Yemeni population. So it's not, I think, that elites or decision makers in Iran feel that Biden is worse or Trump is worse. But some of them believe that Trump has that advantage, that he is so widely disliked and despised that it could help Iran. Others, I think that no, it would still be best if he was to be removed. So I don't think that there's a consensus among decision makers in Iran, or people of influence, but I think ordinary people want him out.
This week, Iran and Syria signed a historic military cooperation deal. I'm wondering what more you can tell us about it and why this development is coming now.
Well, one of the things that I would like to remind your viewers is that many in the United States were shedding crocodile tears for the people of Syria during the last few years, even though, the U.S. government and, of course, back then, now the Turks and the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Qataris are all at each other's throats. But back then, they were all cooperating together to overthrow the Syrian government, and they were supporting these extremists. But, under, I think, one could say, U.S. supervision. And, it's both through Turkey and through Jordan that much of the misery that was brought about for the Syrian people was being coordinated. But they justified this by saying that the Assad regime, again using the term regime, is how cruel it was and how they're killing their own people and how President Assad has killed hundreds of thousands of his own people and that sort of narrative, in order to justify their support for these crazy extremists carrying the black flag. But what is their justification now? Or why are they silent now about the sanctions? I mean, the laws that have been imposed through the Caesar Act, the sanctions, are extraordinarily painful, and they're killing people. The objective is to kill people. And no one says anything about that. So if they were so worried about Syrians in the past, why are they not worried about Syrians today? Why are they not complaining that it's in fact their own government that's murdering Syrians? So,
in fact, it's under the guise of caring for Syrians that lawmakers even passed this legislation.
But no sane person, I mean, I understand how pundits and how, the media, which is linked to the quarters of power, how they would justify dirty wars, saying that the other side is worse, or how they would justify aggression by falsifying intelligence, such as the Iraq War, or such as what happened in Syria and elsewhere, in Libya. And, there are so many wars that, it's back when I was young, we spoke about Vietnam. Now there are so many Vietnams out there that we forget, they get lost on, in the discussion, or they're forgotten in the discussion. But, but when the whole country is sanctioned, that means you are targeting children, women, men, the elderly, everyone. How can anyone justify this? It's insane. And we do remember what Albright, I think everyone who follows these issues remembers what Albright said about, it being worth it, the sanctions in Iraq, which led to the deaths of arguably hundreds of thousands of people. 500,000, it was said in that interview. Regarding the numbers, of course, they're different numbers. But in any case, it was the principle, how she justified the massacre basically a massacre, the genocide that was carried out in Iraq, and now they're doing the same in Syria. But it's extraordinary how silent the media and how pundits are in the West. And I think it's revealing. It's very revealing, and it also helps reveal what their real intentions were when they were supporting ISIS and Al Qaeda and other groups in Syria. And they never cared, even though they were crying out for the Syrian people. They never cared about the Syrian people at all. they're quite pleased with the suffering that takes place. So Syria, which has been, which has survived the onslaught of these extremist groups, the murderous ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which still continue to be supported by powers abroad in Idlib, they survived that. They also are surviving these brutal and barbaric sanctions. But also the Israeli regime is constantly attacking Syrian positions. They're not attacking, by the way, Iranian positions. Mm-hmm. If they were, they could give a few Iranian names. I mean, if there are dead Iranian soldiers or if they've murdered Iranian or Hezbollah soldiers, they could give the names. All these people have online accounts, there are funerals, there'd be funerals, and, their families would, you can't hide dead people, the names of dead people. So they don't kill Iranians. They don't target Iran. The Israelis are actually very careful not to target anything Iranian. There's a sort of unwritten agreement. But what the Israelis do is, in order to justify their attacks on Syrian government positions, they say it's Iranian. Even though it doesn't make a difference, the Iranians are in Syria at the request of the Syrians. They're there legally and legitimately, and this is all aggression and murder. But in any case, they're not targeting Iranians, they're targeting Syrians. And the reason why they're doing so is that they want to prevent the Syrians from getting rid of Al-Qaeda. Because you know quite well that alongside the Golan Heights, for years, the Israelis helped
Trump Heights,
and Al-Qaeda. You visited Syria, I think, so I don't, you know this as well as I. Now the Israelis, every now and then, they try to carry out attacks in order to weaken the Syrian army. But also, I think, in addition to that, this is something personal. This is Netanyahu's attempt to show himself as, being strong and to get reelected, because Israelis, like to see dead bodies outside their borders, many of them at least. So I think part of it is because he wants to stay out of jail. So some of these attacks have to do with, internal Israeli politics, and some of it has to do with the Israeli attempt to strengthen these extremist groups, or at least to weaken the Syrian army. So what the Iranians are doing now is that they have decided to cooperate with the Syrians to help set up Iranian air defense systems, surface-to-air missiles. We know how they work. We've already seen them down a number of American drones. And, that is going to make things much more different and more dangerous for the Israelis when they want to carry out attacks on Syria in the future.
I was actually in Jerusalem a few years back. It may have been in 2018, 2017, when Syria did shoot down an Israeli jet flying over its airspace. I believe that was the first time in decades an Arab nation had actually responded to Israeli aggression, and it was quite remarkable to see and to be in the region at that time. But I wanted to turn to Lebanon now, Syria's neighbor, which is also currently reeling from the impact of intensified U.S. economic aggression. Why is the U.S. targeting Lebanon now, and how will these developments impact the region as a whole in terms of Lebanon's relationship with the United States and other countries in its neighborhood?
Well, I think this is a part of a broader U.S. policy that all of the tools in the U.S. toolbox for subjugating nations have now failed. They failed to destroy the resistance in Yemen. Now Saudi Arabia has lost the war in Yemen. And if this war continues, I think it will lead to instability inside Saudi Arabia. The costs are so high for the regime. And in addition to that, the Saudis are not earning nearly as much money through their oil sales as they were before. The situation inside Saudi Arabia is very difficult. They're waging a war in Yemen. They're implementing a siege against Qatar. They have terrible relations with Iran, with Turkey, and now they want to, there's confrontation between the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Egyptians on the one hand, and the Turks and the Qataris on the other in Libya. And these countries in the past were accusing of Iran of all sorts of things in Syria, of sectarianism, but they're killing poor innocent Libyans in their war of conquest. in that country. Of course, the catastrophe in Libya was created by Obama and the Europeans, especially the British and the French, that they lied their way into destroying the country, and they created this catastrophe that we now see. But now these countries are fighting over the spoils of Libya. But in any case, the United States, its policies against Iran, against Lebanon, against Yemen, against Syria, and against the resistance in Iraq and elsewhere, it's failed. And the only thing that they have left is sanctions. So they sanction people. They cause as much suffering as possible. And this is something that, of course, the Israelis have been doing for a very long time in Gaza, in particular. Of course, in all areas where the Palestinians live, you see these sort of policies. But in Gaza in particular, the Israelis restricted even the food that would come in or the fuel that came in. The amount of misery in Gaza is something that we all know quite well. But it hasn't overthrown the will of the people of Gaza. It hasn't. It's only made people despise the Israeli regime more. And so what the Americans are doing to Iran and now to Lebanon or Syria is only creating greater anger. I mean, it may create unrest. You may see people in Tehran, some people go to the streets and burn down a building, or some people in Beirut chant slogans against Hezbollah. But the underlying disgust and hatred for the United States, I think, causes damage that can't be calculated in numbers. So the Americans are basically trying to bring Lebanon to its knees, to force them to abide by Israeli demands, so that the Israelis could expand their territorial waters, so that they could start extracting natural gas from what is Lebanese territorial waters, so that the Lebanese will give concessions to Israel, so that Hezbollah will be dismantled, and thus making Lebanon completely vulnerable to any future Israeli attack. The Americans are, they're willing to do anything, the American government, of course, to do anything in this region for the Israeli regime, whether it's supporting ISIS and Al-Qaeda, or whether it's bringing about hunger and starvation, or whether it's bombing a country, back to the Stone Age, as they like to say, in Iraq and Yemen. It's a lot of it has to do with Israel. It's not, and the reason why they do that for Israel is not necessarily strategic. A lot of it is ideological, a lot of it is cultural, a lot of it is emotional. There are many things involved, but at the moment, they are trying to sacrifice Lebanon.
You brought up Yemen, and I wanted to discuss what's happening there more. You say the Saudis have lost the war, and I noticed this week the United States was trying to make noise about the conflict there, claiming that it seized a shipment of Iranian weapons en route to the Houthis back in June, Pompeo making a statement about that. And the UK also announced that it will resume weapon sales to Saudi Arabia, which has essentially been bombing Yemen since 2015. What is your read of these developments, and why do you say the war now has essentially come to an end?
Well, and this is another thing. I mean, one reason why I don't believe that there is a free media in Western countries is the very fact that their governments can sell these weapons to the Saudi regime. That is the place where the ideology of ISIS and Al-Qaeda has emerged, and where much of the funding for these groups came from. The Saudi regime carries out genocide in Yemen, and Western governments, or Western regimes, let's call them, they support Saudi Arabia, and there's no outrage. You would think that the media, a free media in the West, would say, isn't this the regime that ultimately was involved in the creation of those extremist organizations that carried out 9/11? Forget what they've done to the people in Afghanistan or Iraq or in Syria or elsewhere, but just to the American people in the United States or in England. But the United States is willing, or more than willing, and Europeans and the Canadians, the Canadian Prime Minister, who likes to portray himself as some sort of humane activist for human rights.
Prince Charming.
Yes, he has the blood of hundreds of thousands of Yemenis. And another thing is that the numbers of deaths in Yemen, they're always low in the media. It's always 10,000, 50,000. It's 1/10 of Syria, according to the media, when you never hear hundreds of thousands, a million. But the situation in Yemen is infinitely worse than in Syria. There's starvation in the country. There's been starvation for years. But the numbers are low. Why? Because the Western media and Western governments and in the corridors of power, it is in their interest to make this something much smaller than what it really is. And so, the media is fine with, the murder of all these Yemeni children. The UN, of course, is not willing to punish Saudi Arabia for what it does, because the UN is, of course, controlled to a large degree by Western powers. But despite that, and it's interesting, so the Americans make a big deal out of like a few, rockets, and I don't believe they're telling the truth, but a few rockets or something coming in from Iran, yet they sell billions of dollars a year, each of these different countries, tens of billions of dollars a year to Saudi Arabia to destroy Yemen. Yet they're outraged by the Yemenis, the resistance, the people, the government in Yemen being able to get a few RPG-7s or something, from fishing boats smuggled into that smuggle them into the country. It's outrageous. It's extraordinary what a dystopia they've created in our region, and how the Western media pretends as if they are the civilized world, where when you look at the reality on the ground, they are, the U.S. government and its European and North American allies, I'm sorry to say, they are probably among the most uncivilized in human history. I mean, I hate Saddam Hussein for obvious reasons, but Saddam Hussein was Saddam Hussein. He was a thug. He used chemical weapons. He murdered. He slaughtered. But he never pretended that he was like some, human rights activist, and that he was a caring person for all of humanity. And that's what makes it so disturbing when one sees leaders, European and American leaders. But I think increasingly, many people in Europe and the United States are waking up to the reality of the dishonesty of their media and the political establishment, which is a good sign. But I think I think a lot has to happen before there's any real change. But Saudi Arabia has lost the war in Yemen. The government in Sana'a, which is the capital of Yemen, has, they've captured more and more territory from the Saudis. They have territory inside Saudi Arabia. They are on the verge of capturing the Ma'rib, which is a key province in northern Yemen. And if they capture that area, the Saudis will have lost their last foothold in the north of the country. And of course, the Saudis and the Emiratis are at each other's throats in the south. The bulk of the population in Yemen, it lives in territories that are controlled by the government that's allied with Ansarullah, or what is often called the Houthis, which I think is very misleading in the West. So the Saudis are in serious trouble, but more importantly, more important than actually losing the war is the amount of money that they're spending in this war, and the fact that their expenditures far outpace their earnings. I don't think that the Saudis will be able to spend this amount of money for much longer. Saudi assets abroad are decreasing. Its sovereign wealth fund is worth much less than it is claimed. A lot of those assets under these global economic conditions are not really going to be worth very much. I don't think there are many buyers right now for many of their assets. So I think the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Qataris, all these countries in the Persian Gulf are in big trouble. Iran is also hurting, but remember, because of the sanctions, ironically, because Iran was not able to export oil, and because Iran doesn't have a big tourist industry, again, because of the sanctions, the hurt that we see in Turkey and and in these countries in the Persian Gulf, we don't have that degree of hurt in Iran because the country has already just adjusted due to the sanctions.
Finally, Professor Marandi, another country in the region which is still recovering from the effects of outside aggressions is Libya. It's been embroiled in conflict since the U.S. and its NATO allies launched a war against the country in 2011, leading to the death of the murder, really, of its longtime revolutionary leader, Muammar Gaddafi. Libya announced it will restart oil production this week, around the same time that UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres asserted that outside interference in the country is at all-time levels. Who exactly controls Libya right now, and what foreign forces are at play in the country?
Well, Libya is a big mess, and it's, as I said earlier, largely thanks to the United States, thanks to Obama, the massacres that we have seen over these last few years. He bears responsibility, and he has a great deal of blood on his hands, and so do the British and the French, among others. But now the two sides that are fighting it out are, on the one hand, it's Turkey and Qatar, and on the other hand, it's the Saudis, more importantly, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Russia, France on the other side. There are other players as well, but these are the ones that are more open in their in taking a position. The Iranians actually are not taking sides. The government officially recognizes the government in Trablus, which is the government that the Turks and the Qataris support, but they do not take sides in the war. I don't think that the Iranian government should have accepted any government in Libya or recognized one side or another. I think that Iran should have said we're just, they should have stood in the middle and maybe tried to help find some sort of negotiated agreement through that. But in any case, the government officially supports the government in Trablus, the Turkish Qatari government, but they have not taken sides in the war itself. But for a while, General Haftar, he has a very extraordinary past, a CIA asset, not a very great person to have as the leader of Libya, but he had the upper hand. He was on the verge of taking even the capital, Tripoli, but the Turks, they invested a lot with Qatari money. They brought in a large number, up to 17,000 people from Syria, the same extremists that they were using to kill Syrians. They sent to Libya to kill the other side in Libya, and one of the the ironies of the world that we live in. But in any case, they were able to take back a significant amount of territory. But I think that now that the Egyptians, they've received a lot of money, most probably from the Emirates and probably some from the Saudis, and the Russians are more deeply involved, and they are going to prevent. They will try to prevent the Turks from making more advances in the country. So at the moment, there's a sort of stalemate. Turkey wants to expand its boundaries in the sea, and its antagonists or its rivals wish to contain them. But all of this is happening at the expense of the people of Libya. That they play a minor role in all this.
They only suffer, and it's just been really sad to see, as you say, a country like that fall apart. I think we have covered quite a bit today, Professor Marandi. I'm always so happy to talk to you because I feel like I get so much information for myself and also for viewers. So I really appreciate you joining me and staying up a little late in Tehran to join Red Lines today.
Well, I'm always happy to be on your show, and I follow the good work at Grayzone, although I'm not sure that's good for me to say, because if people hear that one of those evil Iranians has anything good to say about Grayzone, then it must be it must make Grayzone pretty bad. But in any case, you do some very good work, you and your colleagues. Congratulations on some of the very eye-opening articles and some of the information that you were able to bring out into the public sphere that no one else had covered. And I hope that you are able to enlighten us more in the future.
Thank you. You're very kind. And I hope that we can come visit you sometime in Iran soon when the world gets back to normal a bit. So take care in the meantime.
You too. Take care. I hope to see you in Tehran.